Fruity Love Philter has some pretty amazing wave shaping abilities that we're going to be taking a look at. And one of the great applications of that is, for example, an 808 bass line. So here is the 808 bass line in case you were wondering what it looks like. We've got a couple of slide notes and different things going on, but the velocities changing corresponds directly with what the Waveshaper is doing. So let me go ahead and solo this again, and let's grab the Fruity Love Philter and put it sort of, let's get that up here. So to give you a sense of what the Waveshaper is actually doing, let's go ahead and come in here and turn it off. This is what the 808 sounded like before. And then when we turn it on. So what a Waveshaper actually does is it just remaps an input to an output. That's all a Waveshaper does. So for example, if I were to play the note C, we see it's being quite messed up here. And in fact, to do this, let me go ahead and turn this Waveshaper off and add another Fruity Love Philter to the mix. So here's a blank, brand new Fruity Love Philter. And if I play a note through here, oh, don't forget to turn off note input. Gets me every single time. So this is our input. And what we're going to do is we're going to come into one and we're going to turn on the Waveshaper. There's a filter. Let's go ahead and turn that off so that we're just looking at what the Waveshaper is doing. Now a Waveshaper, its whole job is to remap an input to an output. That's all it does. And so this thing, when it's a line, when it's just a line that comes across and you can right click to reset the bevels and stuff. This basically says, if something comes in, let's just, instead of getting all technical with the units, let's just say it comes in with a loudness of 2. Well, it would come into 2 and it would go up, and you notice here that we go over 1 box, 2 boxes, and then we go up 1 box, 2 box. So we would go out at a 2. So this volume, if it came in at a 2, it would leave at a 2. It would be unchanged. And if we came in at, like I said, say a 4, we'd go over 4, and we'd come up to wherever this line is, and this would say, oh, well, we leave at a 4. So this line basically says whatever the input is, it's going to be the same on the output. It's not going to change it at all. Now check this out. We can do something different. We can add in, and if I were to play a note, nothing has happened. Now check this out. We can do some weird stuff now. I could say, hey, if something's between the value of 4 and 8, I'm just sort of giving these things numerical names. Let's say that we want it to be 4 still. So now if something comes in, if it's between this loudness region, it's going to be turned down. So before, right, this would have been a 5, but it's going to come up. It's only going to come out as a 4. It's going to come out softer. And this one will come out softer. It'll also come out as a 4. So this one's been turned down even more. And this one's been turned down even more. So any values that come in that are between these 2 points, they're going to be turned down. And if we look at what happens to our waveform, we get a line starting to appear. Let me make it even more dramatic. So let's say that we have something like this. Okay, so to make this extra clear, I'm going to use a sine wave just so it's very easy to see. And I'm going to use a lower tone. So there's our sine wave. So any values, right, that are between that loudness that's between here and here. So they're going to be like somewhere between here and here. Well, they're going to be turned down. So we expect to see a line show up because those values are going to be turned down and they're all going to be the same amount of loud. So if we turn this on, we get the lines to appear, and then we can move this around and you will see those lines because we're affecting specifically the values. We're remapping them. We're changing where they are. They don't have to be softer. We can make them louder than they actually were. So here we could say, hey, all you guys above there, turn them up to this loudness. We get a square wave looking thing. This is basically instantaneous compression. And that's all that a Waveshaper really is. It just takes the numbers in. Because remember, what we're looking at here is just a graph of numbers going by. So it's just looking at those numbers and saying, oh, well, you were this number before. Well, now you're this number. It just gives it a new number. So we could do things like, we could leave this part alone. We could have a weird spike and leave everything else alone. So all this stuff, if the number comes in, it'd go out the same, except for these numbers right in this little region, right? This would be randomly turned up and everything else would be fine. And that's how it works. Now, if we play a softer note, the values might not reach all the way to the top. They might only go part way. So if I play a really soft note, there's no weird spike. You can see it right here. We got our note. No weird spike because it's not, no values are reaching this level. So nothing is getting remapped. If I play louder, right there, we begin to see it right there at the tip of the sine wave. We begin to see it begin to be affected. So this is a wave shaper. That's what wave shaping does. And now, what this means for sound design is a million things. There's so many possibilities. Now, you may have been astute and noticed that the negative side of the sine wave was affected the same way as the positive side. That's because this is a unipolar mode. And so you can actually change this to be asymmetrical. And what happens is now we can affect the negative side independently of the positive side. So this basically just accounts for negative numbers. So if we were to grab this point and let's go ahead and let's just move it up somewhere weird and play a loud note. We can move this. We're just changing the negative side now. So we're able to remap the inputs separately in the asymmetrical mode. And this is what wave shaping brings to the table. Now, distortion as a general process adds harmonics to your sound. And I have a whole video explaining the basics of distortion and what it's doing and why you might pick one kind of distortion over another. But the great thing about wave shaping is it's like all kinds of distortions. It's really up to you how you build it. There's a couple of general principles though that if you understand this about wave shapers, you'll better understand how to predict what this sound output will be, what it's going to do to your sound. So the first part is these values down here at the bottom of the graph correspond to points that are near zero, right? Very, very small points. In a lot of sounds, this corresponds to noise. There's a lot of like small signal noise around there. So if you play a recording through here and you do a shape like this, you're going to round out the louder parts of the waveform. And you're also going to bring out some of the higher points, but not as much as these points up here. These are going to get turned up in a different way than the stuff down here. This curve is non-linear, so it's going to treat it differently. And this is the effect of brightening a sound up, specifically like a recording. So for example, if I were to take this sound here, and instead of going to track 5, what tracks are we looking at here? 31. We're going to put it on track 31. So this is a... Yeah. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put this linearly where it was at. And when we bring this up, it doesn't sound too much like there's a distortion. It sounds more like we're just brightening the sound up. And if I were to come over here, all these small signal stuff that's in here, you see all this like small stuff here? That's going to be mostly in here, right? Because that's the softer stuff. So it's going to live in this area. So if I grab this area specifically, yeah. And this is a pretty common effect that you hear people do. They'll use this to bring up sounds and make them sound louder, but you notice the rest of the sound isn't really touched that much. In fact, we can put it back so that it's basically untouched. I think it would actually go down here. And we could add a separate point in, bring this up. And you can begin to dial in this effect. So it has almost mixing properties to it that I find extremely useful, because it's essentially, again, instantaneous compression. It's just responding to numbers coming in. So that is an interesting property. But with a sine wave, right, it's not got all those other frequencies. So you got to keep in mind when you're processing a waveform with a set pattern of harmonics, it's going to act differently than a waveform that's got, like a recording that's got tons of different frequencies all over, and they each have like different things they're doing. Some parts are making up the voice. Some parts are more important for the performance and the intelligibility of the voice. Some parts are noise, and you generally don't want those, but sometimes they can be useful. So there's all these different things you can do. But when we have a static wave, it's going to behave differently because every single harmonic kind of has a job in that waveform. So a sine wave, right? One frequency. When we distort it, we can add frequencies. See all these harmonics that begin to show up? That's covered in the distortion video, so I'll guide you to that. But there's a couple interesting, there's really one more interesting case I want to cover. You might think that if we do something like this, we're going to turn the sound down, right? It's going to get softer, right? We told everything in this region to get softer. This is not the case. It'll actually sound a ton louder, and they will have high harmonics everywhere. Let me show you. There you go. So maybe not a ton louder, but it's louder than before. And the reason is sharp lines correspond to higher harmonics, and specifically a square wave harmonic set of harmonics. So you're going to introduce a squarish sound whenever you do this. So what if we did something that was a little less squarish? We're still going to get a ringing kind of a tone, and we'll make these a little more exponential as well. You notice we took the bright edge off of it. There was that extra crispy ringing before. Now it's been removed to a much bigger extent. That's thanks to these curves, which is why you might consider curving what you're doing. But also in addition to this, we have an interesting thing that goes on. We can actually have something that acts just like a gate. So we could have a gate, for example, like this. So if you've ever been on Discord or in TeamSpeak or something where you were talking and you had to talk a certain amount of loudness before it would let your voice through, that's basically what this is doing. This is a bit different because it's doing it instantaneously. So you're going to run into some additional weird artifacts, but it's a kind of a similar principle. And when we do something like this, where we say, okay, everything past here is fine, but then we begin to turn it down after this, this is essentially compression. It's just instantaneous compression because it looks at every individual number, and so you get a distortion. So that's wave shaping. Hopefully that's a bunch of examples. Hopefully you understand that like something like this will make your sound softer because it's turning down the whole sound. But something like this will not make your sound softer. And instead it will invite higher frequency content because of the line shapes that you've used. And on some parts of the sound, they're left totally alone. So over here, the sound's totally fine, but over here, the sound is getting turned down. And so it's being turned down. This sound's also been turned down, but it's been turned down in like a different way. And this of itself, because it's happening so fast, it's doing each individual number as it comes in. What ends up happening is you get a new set of harmonics. So it's just a really, really interesting thing. And when we get into Maximus, you'll actually see more of this in action. And again, the Fruity Waveshaper will revisit this topic. So let's go ahead and jump into the application that I have here. All right, so in here, we've got a couple of things going on that build on what we talked about previously. So first off, filter. So we're coming in filter 1 and we're routing through filter 2 and then going out. Notice there's no output for the first filter. So it's got its own output. However, filter 2 has its own input. So just keep that in mind. This I sort of noticed after the fact. So it's just sort of a byproduct. Wasn't an intentional decision. So I selected a low pass filter for the first one. And I specifically selected low pass 3 because I wanted to mess with this drive knob. I actually learned a lot of weird stuff about this drive knob along the way. For example, if you drive the resonance super hard, and then drive the drive hard, you get that pop sort of resonancy sound. And on some sounds, it would begin to almost self-oscillate, and it just sounded really, really wild. So some really interesting possibilities I hadn't even thought of doing before. But essentially, I just dialed up the drive until I got something that sounded cool. I knew it was going to brighten up the sound, and so I was trying to find a sweet spot. And messing with the drive in combination with the unison and the different filter modes can produce really different textures. So this is on Alt Dual. If we go to triple, listen, that's like so different. That's way more subdued. If we go to dual, dual's pretty similar in this case. Single. I might actually switch to triple after this because I kind of like what it did to the sound, but we're going to stick with Alt Dual for now. So you can use all your filter knowledge here to mess with this. Turn the Waveshaper on. I'm using asymmetric, and notice that I'm pulling the negative side down harder than the positive side. And this causes this sort of wonky looking shape on the bottom, but not on the top. It was just an experiment. If you asked me, oh, did you have some specific idea in mind? There was a general principle I was following, which was I was going for a square-ish looking thing, which a squarish thing will result when you push it like this. And I wanted it curved because I wanted to avoid that really weird high-end ringing problem. And so that's essentially what's going on here. So that's what's creating the general shape. I didn't want it totally squarish because then you get the ringing and stuff again, which is taken care of by this curviness. If I went ahead and, you know, made it more square, that's, yeah, you get that lovely result. So I didn't want that result, obviously, for this case. So that's the Waveshaper in the first filter. Then we move over to the second filter. This Waveshaper is essentially just a brightening Waveshaper, which we talked about earlier with the vocal example thing. So I'm using the state variable filter on this one. Again, tried out different filters. They each sounded different. And notice that I have the Waveshaper. It's a totally different Waveshaper than the one on 2, or the one on 1. That's kind of confusing. 1 and 2 have different Waveshapers. And that's something that's really nifty. Definitely take advantage of this as you go through your stages. You're able to apply different kinds of distortion. This one, I went ahead and left it as unipolar. I didn't want to mess with any bipolar stuff, so just sort of left it that way. To me, I was looking more to just brighten the sound up. And then I brought down the low band until I got an amount of ringing that I was happy with. And something that's interesting is because we've done this is louder and softer sounds are going to respond kind of differently. So especially over here, if the sound is louder or softer, it's going to be pushed further on this curve. So sounds that are louder are going to be, the difference between the positive side and the negative side will become more important. And it runs into the second filter, which is being brought up in general. So these kind of complement each other as shapes. And if you're going to run Waveshapers right next to each other, unless you do some really severe filtering, I highly recommend picking basic shapes. You can get really crazy. I find that just really crazy shapes are really hard to rein in. So anyways, there's that. I also didn't talk about the cutoff, but this was just set manually. I just, you know, listened to the sound and eventually I settled on something that I was happy with. This is going to affect the kind of frequencies that come in here. So less stuff goes around the 0 point because I'm filtering it out. So more of the low end mid lows will come in here. There's still some high mids in this though. So that was before. And this is something that after you have a line that you're ready to work with, I highly recommend just coming in and trying it out. So that is essentially the patch, and that is Waveshaping in general. Let's open up the MIDI itself. So this is the MIDI. I was experimenting with different notes, and there's this whole synthesis thing we could get into. But you can see I took advantage of the different velocity levels because of the way the Waveshaper works. So if I were to come over here and look at it, let's look at an interesting example right here. So I have these repeating notes, and they slowly get louder and more aggressive. Check it out. If I had them all softer, there's a lot of potential here because of the way we've set up the Waveshaper. And it gives a lot more flexibility with the 808. And I kind of held back from doing any more processing. I kind of wanted to, but I just sort of moved on because I wanted it just to be the Fruity Love Philter and what it does. So there's some examples with the Fruity Love Philter, the Waveshaper, an application. Hopefully you have some intuition when you grab a Waveshaper, because at first it's just kind of like, what the heck do I do with this thing? And you grab the line and you just sort of move it around. If you get something cool, then you say cool and you move on. It's hard to be creative with it because you don't know how to be directional with it. So hopefully this has answered some of those things. You could try a brightening curve. You could try adding in some sharp edges, remapping some outputs in ways you think would sound interesting. You now know how this perhaps could add interest to your sound, given different velocity levels. And so you might even just take the regular old Fruity Waveshaper, this guy, which is basically just this separated from it. They include the Waveshaper in some other plugs too. And you can go ahead and just add this on to perhaps a sample or something and get a similar sort of effect. So you can get a little more use out of your sound and keep it sounding really cool. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe and hit that bell icon for future videos. And have a blessed day.